During a brutal dawn raid, a rancher's daughter was taken by Apache warriors. But as her captors argued over her fate, one young warrior stood between her and their laws. Not with a weapon, but with mercy. He had defied his own tribe to protect the very girl he was raised to hate. What she did next changed both their worlds forever. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? They came at sunrise just as the frost melted off the dry blue-stem grass. A dozen Apache warriors riding like thunder over the plains toward the Harper Ranch. Their silhouettes cutting across the sky like storm clouds with rifles raised and war cries slicing the still air. And by the time Thomas Harper reached for the shotgun over the hearth, it was already too late. His wife Margaret fell screaming by the root cellar. Their oldest hand, Amos, lay bleeding near the paddock. And his daughter, 19-year-old Evelyn Harper, was torn from the barn where she'd been milking the goat. Her hands bound in leather thongs, her bonnet torn away, and her pale face vanishing behind a curtain of black horse mane as she was thrown across the saddle of a warrior, whose face was marked with old burns and eyes like coals. And though Thomas staggered into the yard firing wildly, the war party vanished over the ridge before he could scream her name, leaving behind smoke, blood, and silence. But Evelyn was not dead. And her story did not end in ashes because as she was dragged across days of dry hills and starless nights into the heart of the Apache territory, one among her captors watched her not with cruelty, but confusion. And his name was DeSoto High, though among the whites they called him Solomon, a young warrior orphaned by cavalry sabers and raised by the shaman Nezra, taught to fight but cursed with a memory of mercy. He remembered the Methodist preacher who once saved his sister from a rattler's bite, and the way his mother once wept when a settler's wife gave them bread in a dry season, and he had never forgotten the shape of kindness in a world that worshipped war. And when Evelyn collapsed from heat on the third day, it was Solomon who gave her water from his flask while the others mocked him, calling him soft, warning that the white girl was to be traded or broken, not pitied. But Evelyn, though bruised and silent, saw the flicker in his eyes and hated him less than the others. And when she awoke with a fever beneath a hide canopy in a camp that smelled of smoke and old sweat, it was Solomon's voice chanting over her with crushed root paste at her lips and a cool stone against her burning neck. And as the days passed, though she tried not to speak, her eyes began to follow him, to wonder why he slept outside her tent and not inside it, why he argued with the elder warriors and fast, furious Apache when they tried to touch her, why his hands trembled after he killed a rattlesnake near her cot. Not with the joy of a warrior, but the sorrow of a boy who hated death. Evelyn was no fool, and though she came from a rancher's blood, she had her mother's wit and her grandfather's Bible-bound spine, and she began to understand. This man was not her enemy, not really, though the world insisted otherwise, and when Solomon gave her a chance to escape during the hunt, leaving a horse untied by the creek, she could have gone. But she didn't, not because she loved him, not yet, but because her heart whispered that safety wasn't behind fences and pale faces, but beside the only man in weeks who hadn't raised a hand against her. And when the elders discovered her unbound, the camp erupted, spears raised, shouts rising like a firestorm, and Solomon stood between her and the blade of Chaska, the scar-faced son of the war chief, who growled that she was his by right of capture. But Solomon roared back in Apache that no man owned a woman, not in war, not in peace, and when Chaska lunged, it was Evelyn who grabbed the spear shaft and screamed for Solomon to run, and together they fled into the cliffs above the canyon, two fugitives from opposite worlds, bound not by chains but by something older than law. Pursued through shadowed passes and rain-starved valleys, they shared fireless nights beneath coyote moons, drank from the same stream, hid beneath the same pines when patrols passed like wolves, And slowly, between hunger and fear and whispered memories, they began to know each other. Evelyn speaking of her mother's garden and her brother who died of fever. Solomon telling of the time his sister sang by a river before the cavalry came. And somewhere in those stories pain turned to laughter, and caution to something gentler. And when he told her that his name meant bear who walks with storm, she smiled for the first time in weeks and said, "You don't need to be a storm," and he replied, "But I'll be the bear that guards you." And then one day, a rifle cracked like a whip across the valley, and Solomon fell to the earth with blood blooming from his shoulder. Evelyn screaming as a band of bounty hunters, white men sent by Thomas Harper, rode down with pistols and ropes, shouting that they had found the girl, that her ransom was done, that justice would be swift. And when they dragged Solomon up by the hair, calling him red devil and filthy breed, Evelyn threw herself at their leader, a man named Barrett Riles, who had once tried to buy her father's land and was now looking at her like she was the prize calf at auction. And when he tried to touch her face, Solomon growled from the ground and Barrett laughed and said, "You think she belongs to you, savage?" And Evelyn screamed, "I belong to no one," and grabbed the rifle from the nearest horse, firing once into the air and once into the leg of the man holding Solomon, standing with her skirt soaked in blood and her voice shaking as she shouted, "He saved me. He kept me alive. You think you're heroes, but you're murderers." And Barrett froze because in that moment he didn't see a broken girl. He saw a fury he couldn't control, and so they left dragging their wounded, leaving Solomon and Evelyn alone in the dust, hearts pounding, futures uncertain. And when they limped into the nearest town 3 days later, the saloon went silent. Men staring as a white rancher's daughter leaned on an Apache warrior like he was her kin, not her captor. And when Thomas Harper came running from the telegraph office, his face cracked with grief and hope, he stopped short at the sight of them and raised his hand to his holster, until Evelyn said, "He is not your enemy. Pa, he's the reason I'm alive." And the look in her father's eyes wavered between rage and disbelief, until she pulled aside her blouse and showed the healed lash marks across her back, then pointed to Solomon and said, "He took every blow that was meant for me. Would you have done the same for a stranger?" And the old rancher said nothing, only stepped aside, letting them pass, and for weeks the town buzzed, gossiped, warned. But Evelyn and Solomon stayed on the edge of it all, renting a cabin near the river, building something neither tribe nor town understood. And though some nights brought rocks through the window and some days brought silence in the general store, there were others who watched and saw not scandal, but something older than bloodlines. Loyalty, sacrifice, love forged in fire. And when spring came, they planted maize and squash. And when Solomon built her a cradle board from cedar and leather, Evelyn cried not from fear, but from the unbearable grace of being loved without condition. And years later, when their son walked into the schoolhouse and the teacher asked his name, he said, "My name is Elias Storm Harper. My father walks with bears and my mother grows roses where fire once burned." And no one laughed, not even the mayor's boy, because legends, once born in blood and silence, grow roots even where hatred tries to starve them. And the ridge above the canyon still bears 2 carved initials, one Apache, one English, side by side, not as scars but as a promise that love, real love, belongs to no tribe but to hearts brave enough to bleed for it.